Hello and welcome to the business of the business. I'm your co-host JP John Poz. With me, of course, is my co-host, the financial wrestling genius himself, Mr. Lavie Margolin. Lavie, how you doing?
Hey, John, I'm doing great. I don't want to delay because today is a very special day. We're here to welcome the legendary Steve Keirn, of course, multi-time best-selling author. As I get the book in the frame here, one of two wonderful volumes of the Chronicles Volume 2. Steve, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks. Thank guys for having me on.
Now, the decision to write the second book, the Keirn Chronicles Volume 2, that's yours or that's Ian Douglas, the author, because there's so much meat on the bone to chew on?
Actually, it's a combination. When we sat down to try to figure out how we're going to formulate the book, I have 44-year career in the wrestling business, so that's not something that you can just condense very easily. I mean, if I'm going to tell stories and tell about the whole thing, then, we realized that I had so much stuff that we needed to do two books. So the first one just went to 1987, and it was the end of the Fabulous Ones with me and Stan Lane. And then the second one picks up where I'm kind of lost, what to do. I'm at an aging situation in wrestling, and I'd already vowed that I'd never be an old wrestler. I wasn't going to get in the ring when I was too old and wasn't aggressive and, had a lot of energy. So I was on a throne of indecision trying to figure out what I was going to do with my life. So it picks up there where I started hunting alligators. I started doing all kinds of things just to stay busy and trying to find a new route, and ended up going through a whole new phase, and then the transition from territorial days into cable days. So that's where it starts, and of course it picks up with Skinner and Doink, and then the aftermath of being an agent or producer for Vince for 6 years, and then running the developmental FCW in the end.
Did the first book exceed your expectations?
Yeah, sure. I mean, to be honest with you, I've been asked to do a book for a lot of different reasons, but most of the time it was just to tell stories. And a lot of the stories I was wanted to tell, I mean, were okay, but I looked at it like my grandkids are going to read this book. Some of them, I mean, and I got five, so one of them's going to read it. So I got to be very careful and, choose and not try to trash people or run the business down or do anything because to me, I understood the wrestling business from day one. I mean, it was never an issue with me so far as whatever it was, not getting a belt, not getting a push, whatever it was. You climb a ladder in territorial days. And so you're green for 5 years and you don't really expect anything. But after a while, wrestling's a game called King on the Mountain in elementary school. And you're really trying to get to the top of the mountain the whole time. And not only your peers, but everybody in competition is aiming for the one same spot. So it's a pretty brutal game. And, I always accepted it for what I got into it, that the business is a work. I mean, I don't have a lot of memorabilia in my house that dates any of the things that I ever did or whatever to try to showcase it. I looked at it like everything I had, belts, costumes, everything I sold. People wanted them. They were collectors. I said, sure. And then I have people say, well, why don't you want to hold on to a belt? You won that belt. I didn't win any belts. I held over 50 titles and not one of them did I win. I mean, it's programmed. You're going to go over tonight. Now you're going to be the champion. Then you're going to lose the belt. Now you're not going to be the champion. But I got all of that. I mean, so unless your ego takes over and makes you want to do things to make accomplishments that really don't have a whole lot of meaning in the aftermath, then that was me. I just I never worried about things I did in my career. I mean, you're not in charge. People said to me, well, when you became Skinner, you'd won so many titles and all that. WWF didn't do anything with you. So they paid me. I put two kids through college. So that was really what I was doing. I was doing a job and never bothered me. And, it's the fans that usually come to me and said, well, you didn't do anything as Skinner. Well, do you think it was my choice? I mean, if it would have been up to me, I'd have beat Hogan the first day in, then I'd have wore the belt for 4 years and retired and went on. But that's not what happened. But it's not like you go, oh, man, I'm so upset. one thing when I started teaching more than anything else is I tried to embellish the ideas of what's the business. Don't compare yourself to everybody else. You're going to always be let down. You're going to think you're cuter. You're going to think you're stronger. You're going to think you're a better wrestler. You're going to think you have a better body. You're going to think, why not me? Don't worry about it. Just roll with it. Enjoy your ride. It's a roller coaster ride. So,
How do you feel about wrestling today? Like when you look at it, some of the guys that you had a hand in training were a part of WrestleMania, either main eventing WrestleMania or just playing a huge part of WrestleMania in general.
yeah, I'm very proud of my students. And here's the thing people need to realize even though I helped and develop a lot of talent, one thing about wrestling is not one person can teach you. You learn certain things from each person that you deal with that has more experience or knowledge than you. What you retain is on your own. But the real education comes when you're just free rolling out there and you're on your own and you're having to figure things out. What I tried to teach them was things like dressing room deals. Like, I mean, if you're not accepted in that dressing room, it's brutal politically. I mean, you could be the best worker in the world, you could have the best everything and not ever get used. And it's because you made somebody mad in that dressing room. And then they knew somebody that knew somebody that knew somebody that knew somebody. I mean, the real way to be accepted is just be very humble. Just accept what happens. And if you have to do a job and put somebody over, do it graciously and to the best of your ability. Just say, sure, no problem. And go out there and give them 100% to get them over and move on. Nobody keeps score of how many wins and losses you have except for you. I mean, I've had people show me my history and say, well, you had like 3,700 matches. I can't guarantee that that's the truth. But at the same time, 7 times a week, 9 times a week for my first 15 years, I'm sure I had close to that many. But how many wins and how many losses? The only time in my whole career I ever heard that was from Hawk, one of the Road Warriors, when they had to do a job for me and Stan. And he goes, brother, we don't get beat. And I'm going, I don't care if you win or lose. It don't matter to me. And he goes, I said, that's what Vern wants. And he goes, well, how many wins and how many losses do you have? And I just looked at him and said, man, I don't know. Probably more losses than wins. I mean, it's not that big a deal. Just, if you guys don't want to win, no problem. We'll lose. I mean, if you don't want to lose, we'll lose. So anyway, it's a mind game. Wrestling is a mind game, and you have to be strong enough to accept it. Too many people don't understand it. Nowadays, it's so scattered and it's so different. I have no complaints about the present wrestling. A lot of my friends and peers do. I covered 4 generations. And some of the ones from the first generation are going, what'd you teach them? And I said, well, I taught them to moonsault. I taught them to do a backflip. I taught them to do a front flip. I mean, I'm about as acrobatic as a turnip. I can't do any of that stuff. So I just taught them what I thought was important. Psychology of how to control your audience, how to let, you be the volume switch and turning them up and down. I said, most talent nowadays, this is what I say about wrestling. In my era, that when I was full-time territorial days and even into the cable days at the beginning early 90s, we did ad lib. We went out there and just threw a match together out there by the response of the audience because every audience is different. Nowadays, they do a match by movement. It's fancy moves, impressive moves, high risk moves, whatever. But that's what your audience is used to now. So in the looks of the attendances and the pay-per-views and everything else, they're very successful. So who's going to argue that and say, oh, that's wrong? It's not wrong. It's just different. I give you, and I don't want to just talk and you guys don't say anything, but I give you the idea of I have. When I was a kid, action movies were Clint Eastwood, John Wayne, Charles Bronson, young people don't even know those names, but they would hunt down a guy and beat up a guy at the beginning of the movie to get it going, then get, in a situation and then maybe kill 1 or 2 people in the end of the movie. Now let's fast forward to John Wick, Keanu Reeves. I sometimes I'll sit there and I'll try to count how many people he kills, and it's like 1,000 in the first 30 minutes. I mean, so that's what's happened to wrestling. They're trying to outdo everything that's happened in the past and trying to outdo each other. When reality is if you look, and you guys are educated in wrestling, if you look, the guys that I know that made the most money had the least amount of moves. I mean,
Yep.
other than a technician like Flair or somebody like that, you talk about Hulk, you talk about Stone Cold, The Rock, any of those big name iconic talents, they didn't do 9 million moves. They control their audience emotionally instead of movement wise. And, a lot of them, had maybe a handful of moves that they'd go to. Now it's just as many moves as you could jam. I used to say, and when I was running FCW, I'd go, man, you're trying to cram 15 pounds of shit in a 5-pound bag. Let some things go. Don't try to give them every move. Just make a story out of it and make it make sense.
Absolutely. Now I'll hand it over to Lavie, who's got some good questions.
Okay.
Thank you so much, and I love sitting at the learning tree, learning from all of your experiences. So, I love both books. Volume 2, one of the most fascinating things to me was the PWF insight, as that was something that I wasn't so familiar with. So I'd really like to concentrate on that for a few minutes, sort of as a case study, sort of to look through the circumstance of that starting, how it went, and ultimately years later, what seemed like a great potential result. So just going back to that time before the start of that promotion, territories were drying up. What was the state of the wrestling business in like the mid to late 80s, if you weren't part of the WWF or Crockett into Turner?
What was the state of the business?
Yes.
It was fading. I mean, Stan and I had come back to Florida after going to AWA, then back to Tennessee for a short time, and then I was getting itchy to try to figure out my destination and my future. And I said earlier, I just vowed never to be an old wrestler. And the reason was when I started wrestling here in Florida, the guys I wrestled, I'd be in 15-minute Broadways with them in small towns all over the state, and it was education. That's where I learned to wrestle, was from old timers. But I was always worried about being an old timer. I mean, I knew that time goes by fast, and I kept saying, I don't want to be one of these guys. I want to figure it out. So I was on that throne of indecision of what I was going to be the rest of my life. And we came back to Florida, and all of a sudden the Crockett's were running it, and it was starting to fade, and they were losing interest in Florida, and Hiro Matsuda had a part in it. And he was already at an age where he was outdated and a dinosaur in the business. It was changing so rapidly that, everything kind of caved in. Now we're sitting here with no territory in Tampa, and WWF is really starting to gain ground, and all top guys from every territory in the country were going to work for them. Well, I still hadn't let go of the fact that I really wanted to get to the top of the ladder. And to me, the top of the ladder wasn't the main event. To me, the top of the ladder was owning the business. I mean, guys limited themselves and said, oh, man, I got to be the main event. I want to be the main event. I said, I don't want to be the main event. I want to be the guy that pays the main event. I want to be the guy that makes all the money and doesn't take any bumps and doesn't have to travel. So anyway, we came up with a bright idea, Mike Graham and myself. I mean, Mike's dad had owned this territory, state of Florida, championship wrestling from Florida for years, and started a ton of us guys together. I mean, my high school class, Dick Slater, Mike Graham, Austin Idol, Hulk Hogan. I mean, we all went to school with Mike growing up. So anyway, we got together, and it was just me and Gordon Soley and Mike Graham at first. And he said, well, we got the Sportatorium. That's where we used to film TV. It's got a ring in there. We can start a business. So we did. And, in the book, you learn how difficult it is. You don't just say, okay, I want to be in the wrestling business. You got to figure things out. Well, there wasn't a lot of input at that time. Gordon had got kind of lazy and he was older. And Mike, he just wanted to keep his body in the wrestling business somehow or another. And so we had to plan things and coordinate things. And we got off to a really good start, but we just didn't have the funding. You need to have somebody with quite a bit of money that isn't afraid to lose a little bit of money to get started. And we didn't have that. We just were on a shoestring down here, but it was amazing what we did with that. And that was like creating talent. When you read in the book, you'll read like Diamond Dallas Page and, even Scotty Levy, who later became Raven, and the Nasty Boys, and all these guys worked for us, and they were lost souls. They had no place to go. And so we had quite a crew for a while. I mean, Terry Funk would come in. There's just, Scott Hall, all of these guys were here and they had no place to go. And so we started running towns and we kept it small, like armories and high schools and stuff. And a couple of big shows at the fairgrounds here in Tampa, and we'd called them reunions or whatever, some kind of gimmick name for wrestling. But, we got our TV going, we got all the things put in place, but we just didn't have the funding to keep it up. And it was kind of embarrassing to try to pay guys, and you're paying them about $25 a night to go out there and perform and risk their neck. So then all of a sudden we got Dusty. And to me, I thought, oh, this is it. Now we got Dusty. As long as you got Dusty in Florida, we're good. But it just wasn't the same. Having people doesn't mean other people know you got them. Promoting is a thing that just really got overwhelmed by so many television channels, so many radio stations, so many opportunities to advertise that you got lost in, what you spent your money on. And the things that worked in the 70s and early 80s weren't working. And this is almost 90 now. And so you had to be creative. So what we'd do is we'd just do poster cards and have talent go out and put the cards out a week before the the show would come to that town. And that's what we relied on. And it was enough to get by, but it wasn't enough to go forward. And so, you have to read the rest of the book to know how it turns out.
Yes, for sure. I have a lot of questions on that, but anything that we should direct people to the book for to really learn, we should definitely.
No, I have no problem with, if my book had a big finish where I dropped dead, I'd probably give you the finish early just so somebody would buy the book knowing, how's he talking? He's dead. I got a running joke with all my friends. There's so many of us that live here in Tampa. There's probably 40 guys that live here in Tampa connected with the business through 4 or 5 generations. So I know them all, but we get together for lunch once a month. And not everybody shows up every time, but we get quite a large group. But, with all of that, we're constantly talking, about what was the past. And now it's gotten to the point where all we talk about is what's wrong with us. Well, my back doesn't work. I've had my hips replaced, da, 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 da. So, any young people that come to luncheons are going, man, you guys are a bunch of old guys talking about all the things that are wrong with you. So with things changing the way it is, it's at a point that you're just like watching, and like I said, my friends are complaining about what's going on in the business, but I keep saying to them, everybody that I trained that's there now from FCW are well over millionaires. They've made so much money they could all retire. We never had that opportunity in the generations before that. We had to live paycheck to paycheck. We had to depend on, if you got hurt, you didn't get paid. And if you didn't make the town, you didn't get paid. So we had to depend on working no matter how injured we were or anything like that, and keep going.
One of the
I'm ramble on if you guys don't control me.
oh no, it's all very interesting. So one of the innovations I noticed right away with the PWF was the training. In that, from my understanding, and certainly from Florida, in my understanding, that if somebody wasn't connected, like you mentioned, Mike Graham's high school, that it helped with an in and so on, or even so, even with Hulk Hogan, right? Like when somebody would come for training, they might get run off or get a leg broken or sustain the sugar hold or something like that. Whereas you came in and said, like, listen, we need guys, and you know, did the best to train them and get them working. Was that like, I'm not sure if that mindset existed much before that.
Well, in Florida, it didn't. I mean, Florida had a reputation. Eddie Graham in Florida had a reputation of when you broke in the business here. My example is by experience. I mean, I was lost. I mean, Eddie kind of took me under his wing when I was just like 15 years old. My dad was a prisoner of war in Vietnam. I met Mike in the 10th grade in a biology class. We became really good buddies. He started taking me to his house. His dad took a liking to me and was a real patriot, and appreciated what my dad was going through as a sacrifice to the country, and started giving me part-time jobs. Well, one of my part-time jobs at 16 years old was picking up wrestlers from the airport and then taking them back to their hotel after the matches here in Tampa. Excuse me. And then I'd see them all beat up. And people say, you want to be a wrestler like those guys? And I'm going, no. I mean, everybody been telling me it's fake, but I'm looking at guys that have got gig marks on their foreheads and Matt Burns, and just beat up looking physically. And I'm going, well, if it's not real, something's happening to these guys that, I don't want to do. I mean, I was pretty when I was a kid, and I didn't want to get beat up. I mean, so went away to college and got on steroids in Jackson, Mississippi, and went from 165 to 240. I came home and Eddie saw me and goes, oh man, you got to get in the business. And I'm going, no way. I mean, I had watched at the Sportatorium people come down wanting to get in business, and I had been invited to sit in there with Mike in the stands, and I watched them brutally get beat up. I mean, they'd come in there, bodybuilders, bouncers, whatever, and, thinking that was all fake and they were going to get in real easy. And Matt Suda, Jack Briscoe, and Bob Roop would beat the dog shit out of them. And I mean, really beat them, face punches, everything. And they'd try to run out and they'd tackle them and all kinds of stuff. And then when it come to asking me, yeah, that's what I want to be when I grow up. No. But when I came back from college, jacked up, Mike was getting married and I was in his wedding, and Eddie kept coming to me and saying, how's college? How's college? And I'm going, it sucks. I wanted to be a doctor, but I didn't have any prerequisites. When they said, what do you want to be when you grow up? I said, what makes the most money? Doctor, lawyer, or Indian chief. Well, Indian chief was out. Lawyer, I didn't want to be inside all the time. So I said, I'll be a doctor. When I went to college, that wasn't as easy as it sounded. So I lost all interest in college. Anyway, Eddie, pride. And I finally, went to my mom. And I told her, I said, I'm thinking about being a wrestler. And my mom says, well, I really wanted you to get your college education. And I said, well, I'll get you a 2-year degree or whatever. And at least you can say I made it through 2 years. So I did do that for my mom. But then I started and I'd come home and my mom would look at me and she'd say, honey, what's wrong with your face? You got marks all over you and your elbows and all this. And I said, well, I don't know, Mom, but I'm learning to be a wrestler at the Sportatorium and I'm getting beat up every day. Now, here's the difference. The difference was I wasn't getting beat up too brutally like the ones that they wanted to run off. I was just getting beat up enough to keep coming. And it wasn't facial punches. It was just demanding work, like trying to do squats to a deck of cards in a building that's 110. And every time you turn the card over, that's your number. And then push-ups and neck bridges and then hitting the ropes and all this and then wrestling. And then you just get stretched. Well, back then, I broke in 1972. Back then, they didn't have that thing called tap out. You had to say, I quit, I give, no, stop. I mean, and I said that a lot. But for 6 months, I went through that. And my mom would say to me, she says, honey, I thought wrestling's fake. And I'd say to my mom and say, so did I, Mom. But whatever I'm learning is not what I watch on TV. I mean, I hadn't seen any similarities. And it was Eddie Graham's way, psychologically, of preparing you for a business that everybody points a finger at and says, oh, that's all fake, and you to protect it. And we use the terminology, and it's kind of a dead term now, kayfabe, and it instills that in you. And Eddie had a deal that if you got in a fight in a bar here in Tampa or in the state of Florida, and you're working this territory, and you lose that fight, you might as well get a U-Haul and move out. So, it brought quite a psychological effect from Florida guys that broke in. And there was so many guys that came here. Orndorff, he was from here. Even Danny Spivey. I mean, Luger started later on with Ron Simmons. I mean, but before that, it was like myself and Austin Idol and Hulkster. And we all went through it. But it gave us a deep appreciation for our business, and we never let our business get knocked too bad. I mean, not till Vince took over and knocked it right on off into reality, whatever. But I mean, it was just a different era. So, in my interpretation of teaching young people, that's not the way I wanted to teach. I mean, my first student was Tracy Smothers because I knew teaching was going to be something that I wanted to do later on. And I felt like the best way to get results was treat people the way I wanted to be treated. I mean, you can't get over the physicality. It's going to be rough. And there's so many things that's going to bother you or hurt, but you don't have to add stuff to it just to try to run you off. And so I just, I take it slower than they took it. And then plus, there was no shooting. And then, it's like, personally, I'm not a shooter. So why am I going to start shooting with young people? And then I never let nobody touch me either. I mean, my bad experiences in teaching when I taught the guys for PWF, like Diamond Dallas Page and that group that came through, John Laurinaitis' brother, Mark Laurinaitis. And I mean, there's a list of guys that, we had to develop right away. I mean, you didn't let them touch you because they didn't know what they're doing. And the most misused phrase in pro wrestling is this: I'm sorry. Well, when they say they're sorry, they've done something to you. And the only way out of it is apologizing. So I didn't want to hear I'm sorry from anybody and I can't get up off of the mat. So I realized that when I watch pro football and other sports, the coaches don't get down there with their helmet on and line up with the linemen. They watch. And so even teaching the trainers that I had at FCW, like Norman Smiley, he is such a gentleman. He wants to get in there and show them how to do it. And I said, Norman, they're going to hurt you. They're going to hurt you. They're going to hurt you. And I preached to them, don't let them touch you. And if you ever get a chance to interview Norman Smiley, ask him the one line that I taught him, because that's what he's going to tell you. Steve Keirn would say, don't let them touch you. And anyway, he hasn't taken that to heart. He's been injured a few times over at NXT, but, that's just the nature of the business.
So one of the talents that you trained, the late Mike Awesome, and I mean this in a positive way, not speaking ill of somebody who has passed. You seem to indicate in the book that like sometimes he would just be like a little goofy. You're trying to teach something serious, and then he would shoot on you or something like that.
Yeah, he was a lot goofy. He had some weird stories, and I never knew how much of what he would tell me was true or not. But he was a young kid, and there was nothing wrong with Mike. It was just that he was, just kind of like trying things, like trying to say things and do things, and it just didn't fit. It was like putting a round peg in a square hole. And yes, he did try to shoot on me, which was a big mistake, even though I can't shoot. You're taught a lot of stuff by those people that train you on crowd control, so far as people jumping in the ring. So my moves are all sucker moves. I mean, but they're effective, and nobody asks you at the end of it, did you fight fair? They just ask you who wins and who loses. And I'd rather be the guy that says I won every time. I might have sucker punched you or hit you in the balls, but I won, so it doesn't matter. That's as far as it goes. But Mike was goofy to the point where he was immature. is probably the best way to put it, because he wasn't like crazy goofy. He was just a little immature. And he was always trying to make an impression on me or any of the other veterans that would be watching what was going on. I mean, he had a sad ending to his life. The Dark Side of the Ring actually asked me to be a part of the Mike Awesome story and everything. And I said I just didn't know enough about him after he went to ECW to really participate. And I hate guys that get on these podcasts or in stories and try to act like they were there. I've heard a lot of guys talking in the past and saying, well, da, 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 da. And I'm going, wait a minute, I was there. That didn't happen like that. Why are you telling that? You know, so if you're not a part of their life full time all the time, then it's pretty hard to kind of like walk in their shoes. For him to go through what he did, he actually climbed the ladder on his own like everybody else has to do. You don't just get pushed. Well, sometimes you do if you're a family member of somebody's, but most of the time you have to climb a ladder and earn your part in the wrestling business. And so he did. He went out, he climbed the ladder, he went to Japan, he went to ECW, he found his niche, he fit in, and he made some money and made a name for himself. But he still, at the end of the day, he still didn't know how to do business right. And he just kind of got lost in the shuffle. And, you know, who knows what drives people to suicide? I don't know. I was confused when they told me he hung himself in the shower. I'm going, wait a minute, he's about 270. I mean, you know, how do you commit suicide in the shower hanging yourself? I was puzzled. I mean, you know, that was more my reaction to the whole thing than sympathy. I'm not a big sympathizer towards suicide. I mean, Eddie Graham committed suicide. Mike Graham committed suicide. Mike's son committed suicide. Mike's grandfather committed suicide. I mean, I even say it in the book. I mean, you know, I'm not a big fan. And, you know, I lost a lot of respect. I mean, you know, I got a dad that did two-time prisoner of war, Germany at age 19, and then Vietnam at age 39 for 7.5 years of torture. And he came home, he didn't commit suicide. He just faced life. So I'm a Christian. I believe in Jesus Christ. I believe he's my savior. So that's my strength. Not everybody believes like I do. So they need to find something. So anyway.
Sure. So you had mentioned before, of course, Dusty Rhodes coming into the PWF. What were sort of your expectations when he was coming? What do you think his were, and why might it not have worked out as well as everyone hoped?
Well, Dusty had planned to come in and really help out, and like I said earlier, when we got Dusty and he wasn't doing anything, I think he got into it with the Crockett's up there, and not really sure, that's been so long ago, but he all of a sudden was a part of it. Well, Dusty, you know, we ran some shows and we well promoted it, but we didn't fill up buildings. And then I'm starting to think, well, what's happening? What's wrong here and everything? Dusty was all on board. I mean, he did everything, but Dusty was still Dusty. I mean, his ego was, you know, pretty good sized ego, but he deserved it. I mean, I've got a ton of respect for Dusty. I mean, to me, and I you could quote me, but Dusty was like a big brother. He wasn't always nice to me. Sometimes I considered Dusty a real dick. But in the long run, he was like a big brother. He would always take up for me, or he would be on my side in a lot of situations that really, you know, politically it was hurting him. Like when I was an agent and he was working for Vince, and I'd stand up and Vince would ask for ideas and I'd give him an idea, and Vince would look at me and say, Steve, you're stuck in the 80s. Man, you got to get out of the 80s. And Dusty would say, well, the 80s were pretty successful if you were around when we were around. But, you know, so with that being said, Dusty contributed. He didn't, you know, just hit and run. He gave it his good shot and worked for, you know, probably about 6-7 months. And then he got an opportunity to move on. And you don't hold nothing against somebody that gets an opportunity to make their lives better and for their family. Kevin Sullivan taught me something a long time ago when I was really young, and it was because I got on Kevin when I went to the Crockett territory in early 70s, and Kevin was up there, and he'd been in Florida, and I didn't like Kevin. He was Mike Graham's partner, but he was a real suck ass. He would, you know, brown nose Mike and stuff, and I go, man, you used to make me sick in Florida, brown nose and Mike. And he goes, Steve, Nobody takes care of you but you. I have to do what I have to do to make a living and support my family. And a light went off in my head. Stop trying to go an opposite way and just relax, and don't be worried about if you're nice to promoters or whatever. I mean, if somebody talks about you in the dressing room, oh, you're just brown nosing the promoter. Yeah, I am. I'm wanting them to give me more money. So I took a whole different slant on life. But Dusty had been every position you could be, plus being an NWA World Heavyweight Champion, and now he was struggling down there in Florida, and he wasn't making ends meet, and he was a heavy spender. He liked to spend money. I mean, so he needed to get back in the swing, and that's when they pulled him up into WWF, and we started losing guys because Pat Patterson and Jerry Briscoe came around one of our TV tapings and started like cherry pickers picking guys. They got the Nasty Boys, they got Dusty, they got Big Steel Man, who later became Tugboat, Fred Ottman. They started then Diamond Dallas Page and just different guys that we had that weren't going to go anywhere and needed to come with them, make that business better. So that's just part of the business. You can't hold, you know, um, any kind of revenge or animosity, because the only person that's going to bother is you. You need to just move on. I mean, and so that's what you try to teach young people. People will say, "Oh, well, I'm better. I can do better." It's not what it's about. It's not what it's about. I mean, here's the best way to explain it. Tom Cruise. Tom Cruise wasn't a movie star till he made a couple of the right movies, and then all of a sudden he's a star. Let's take Shawn Michaels. Shawn Michaels was a real jabroni when we were doing the Fabulous Ones, him and Marty. And I mean, he's nice and everything, but he wasn't really on top of a ladder. And then, he held it together, and he stayed in WWF when all of us bailed and went to WCW for contracts and everything. And so Shawn rightfully earned his position, and he climbed the ladder, and he stayed up on top of it for quite a while. But he wasn't anything exceptional. So it's just a star is made in the business. I mean, you don't become into it an instantaneous star, except for nowadays. I'm noticing social media plays a big part in you getting in the business here nowadays, because if you get the large following, then that brings those people to watch you. Makes sense. But at the same time, maybe you suck. So somebody that you work with better make you look good. That's the new business.
So, thank you. As you detailed in the book, after a while, it just, it wasn't working to the degree that maybe everyone hoped, and it might be time to look for other opportunities. But was the final straw sort of, I think there was an office worker who was misusing a credit card?
Yeah, the receptionist, the lady that worked the front desk and handled all the incoming calls to a sportatorium there. We had her with they talked me into being the president of PWF, which I was thinking, hey, that's great. I'm the big name. But that wasn't a good idea, because all responsibilities, liabilities, and all the debt went on me personally. The American Express card we got was in my name, but it was um, it was a credit card to do all of our expenses on. She actually ran up about 20 grand on it one Christmas right there when we were about to fold, and I ended up having to eat that bill. I spent most of my time with Skinner paying off PWF. The money I made as Skinner, I had to pay off a truck that had gotten repossessed. I had to pay off that American Express and some of the other debts. So it's just a business that you're a babysitter to a certain degree. You got to watch everybody from getting in trouble. You got to watch everybody from stealing. You got to watch everybody from everything. But that's part of the business. These are not complaints. These are the things that I understood. I mean, when I actually did PWF, I'd already been in the business like 20 years. I'd been all over territories and everything, and so I had a common knowledge of things, but not the working insides of the business, the booking and all of that. So that's where I got my feet wet with booking and, running the territory and the finishes and, making sure that everything's in place when the show starts and, you know, running live events and picking towns and, trying to spread money as thin as you could just to get in and to hopefully to just kind of get a break. We were just kept waiting to turn a page, let's turn a page and go forward. But it was like every time we did something, I can remember one time that set us back. We were going to the Bahamas and we had everything in place. Bahamas Air was giving us free travel. We had all the places over in the Bahamas giving us free hotel rooms. We had the Nassau Coliseum and an old guy named Charlie Majors that promoted for Eddie all intact. And we get to the airport one time and I had Barry Windham and no, I had Kendall Windham and Blackjack Mulligan, his dad, booked over there, and they didn't show. And then I had Brickhouse Brown. He showed up, and they come to me and said, "Hey, Steve, one of your guys is at security." Brickhouse Brown's wife had put a gun in his bag because she was mad at him. He got caught with a gun in his bag going through security, so they kept him there. Kendall and Blackjack didn't show up, so I didn't have a semi and I didn't have a main event by the time we got to Nassau. But Blackjack and Kendall had been arrested for counterfeit money and they were being held in a jail under aliases. So, it was like a lot of things happen when you're trying to be a promoter. And so when we finally just pulled the plug on it, I was happy. It was like I took something off of my back and I wasn't carrying it any longer.
So one of the unique parts, of course, fast forwarding years later, all of your accomplishments between that period and 20 years forward, was that one day, I believe it was Kevin Dunn came and said, do you still have those tapes for the PWF?
Yeah, that happened when Vince was creating a network. They were creating a network and they had so much stuff and they had so many tapes and libraries and from territorial days when guys had sold out and turned over tapes. Well, Kevin Dunn, the director for the TV at WWE, well, it might have been WWF back then. Anyway, came to me and said, "I understand you have a library." And I said, "Yeah, I've got the PWF library, but it's only about a 2-year library." And he said, "Well, we'll buy it from you." And that library had sat in my garage here in Tampa for like 6-7 years, and it was like even maybe longer. And, with not even trying to take care of it, it's 100 degrees in your garage here in Florida in the dead of the summer. And so I said, "Well, I don't know what condition they're in, but yeah, you can buy them." Because I couldn't figure out what to do with them. I had tried to sell them before, but a couple of people I tried to sell them to said, "Well, you got to have a release, sign releases for all this talent that's on them." And I go, "We didn't do that. I mean, and I was a part of this. We didn't sign releases. You got on TV and you wrestled and that was it." So there was no real documentation for it. Plus you had to have a rundown of who it was. A lot of the matches didn't have talent sheets. So, but I got together and got me a machine that would play them, and I put together the time sheets and I put together the talent thing and I sold it to them and I walked away really happy. I mean, but I don't know what they ever did with those tapes, but at the same time, that's how the library got sold.
Yeah, I loved that story. Now, the satisfaction of that, without necessarily, of course, revealing the price. I'd imagine if you wanted to, it would be in the book. But did it sort of like make up for all the heartache and like make you whole from having promoted back in the day, or was it just like a nice unexpected bonus?
It was like a nice unexpected bonus. It doesn't wipe away the tears. I mean, you just that's part of your experience. I mean, that stays with you. It doesn't go, "Oh, wow, I'm glad I had that." It goes, "Wow, thank you, Jesus," because that's the only way that became something that was worth of any value. I mean, so to me, I give God all the glory. And, people don't like to hear it sometimes, but that's too bad. If they're going to talk to me, they're going to hear it. But I figured these things out. You know, when your dad's a prisoner of war from the time you're 13 to 21, you get really confused in life. And I used to say, you know, I grew up without a dad. I grew up without a dad. But you know what? Nothing ever happened. And I made it through my life. I'm 72 years old now. And realistically, I don't walk with a cane. I don't have any severe injuries. I've had my hips replaced and I've had general maintenance done to my body and things like that. I'm not like a virgin here so far as surgeries, but God's been good to me. I mean, you know, when I show up at a lot of my reunions and things, everybody's got a cane. I almost feel guilty. I start looking around to borrow somebody's cane so I don't get heat for not having a cane. But, you know, it's the idea that, you know, you have to understand what you're dealing with in the wrestling business. And, you know, the wrestling business creates opportunities for injuries and history and all of those kind of things. So, with me being a son of a prisoner of war, I always looked at it like, you know, that was a miracle. My dad came home. I mean, you know, he was on the first plane home when the war was over. But, you know, you think in 7.5 years, that don't sound long, but when you're a POW, that's a long time.
Yeah, it's really an amazing story among many. Let me turn it over to John.
Mr. Kerr, one last final push for the book of why everybody should get it.
Okay. Well, if you got the first one and you enjoyed the reading on the first one, then this is definitely something you should pick up on. Or if you enjoy history of pro wrestling, you're going to go through 4 generations with my books. I went through 44 years. So it's not just a wrestler just trying to hang on. There's a lot in the stories, but it really gives you an insight for what's going on in the wrestling business or what people go through. I mean, you know, I'm not an icon like Hulk Hogan or Stone Cold or The Rock or anything like that. I accept that, but I'm a soldier. I'm not one of those guys that was a soldier in the business that went through the ups and downs of wrestling and the generations and all the changes and everything and survived. But at the same time, you know, somebody that likes history, Ian Douglas did a tremendous job on my 44 years, and he creates a history that, you know, is really hard to find anybody else that went through what I went through. I mean, you know, time wise, average wrestler lasts about 10 years to 15 years. But when you get into this business and you get deeper and deeper into it, then, you know, the only way you're going to find out what happened is buy the book. I mean, you know, the reading on the book is simple. It's not like difficult. And Ian does a great job to tie one chapter to another and keeps you going. And so even when I proofread the book and I thought, well, there's too much technical stuff about PWF and being an agent and all that. And he said, well, you know, a wrestling fan would be interested in knowing more about those things. So that's why we put it together like we did. So hopefully people will enjoy it. Take the ride with me.
And everybody can get the book on Amazon, the Keirn Chronicles Volume 2. Yes, there it is. Awesome cover there with the Alligator Man, Skinner, and Doink as well.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Keirn, thank you so much for all the time. Really appreciate it.
You guys for having me. Sorry, there's a little confusion at the beginning, but good to get on. Appreciate the opportunity to be on. God bless everybody watching and you guys too.
God bless. Thank you so much, Mr. Keirn.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. And before we wrap this bad boy up, just a few little news nuggets. Don't want to go crazy on time here, but a few little news nuggets just because I felt like the AEW DAZN was very interesting, right? Is AEW gone from DAZN?
Yeah, that's our understanding as to what's been reported. That it was a multi-year deal, but there was certain expectations, I guess, on DAZN's part in terms of revenue, and they had an out after the first year, and they took it. DAZN covered with the AEW deal, not all worldwide rights. We know Triller has some, as well as they have domestic traditional cable television distribution in different places as well, including like TNT Africa, for example. But it covered places like Azerbaijan, for example. So a fairly small market, part of the former Soviet Republic, of course, but in volume, a number of different markets, and you never want to see that with a promotion that needs more international exposure to potentially lose a deal. It's interesting, as we were thinking about it, like, Triller might be stronger in some markets than others, the Zone in others as well, but it's also a question, sort of like, is the streaming market for pro wrestling coming for a reckoning? Well, if you were to look at Triller as it merged recently with AGBA, according to its stock, it's doing really, really well. It's over a 3 as we're recording this, or before the market opened, at least. So it went from a penny stock, 40 cents, to $3 a couple weeks after the merger. But I think it's still pretty volatile. Interestingly, Wing Fai Ning, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, one of the executives of the AGBA, was Triller Campus, and that made me think. Sometimes, what do they say? Glory comes before the fall, or whatever it may be. But starting spending more in something like this, it's something of concern. So let's see if Triller does, the stock keeps growing, and, they're flush with money and so on, they could continue to grow. But that's something to be seen. And then with the Zone now letting go of AW, I believe that they still have some rights to TNA. If there was no Triller, which we have no reason to believe there won't be, and the Zone isn't as interested in pro wrestling, like, what is the big independent exposure points for promotions now, right? So you don't have as much of that infrastructure, whereas a few years ago you had different competitors, and these two sort of emerged as some of the biggest streaming platforms, not only for pro wrestling but for sports and distribution.
Now, with that though, Triller can kind of just replace the Zone in a lot of those areas, and they can kind of pick up where they left off, I guess, right?
I think so. In theory, I think the question really is, like, does Triller, like, focus on certain markets and not others, again, just because it's top of mind? Like, how are they doing in Azerbaijan compared to the Zone? I don't know, but for the most part, you would imagine with, like, a streaming service that if Triller is working successfully with AEW, and we know that there's the formal AEW Plus service, that you'd imagine that it could be picked up. I guess the question is, why wasn't it fully picked up before? There must have been some sort of reason. I mean, partly it could be financial, but partly it could be like a distribution or logistics reason for why the Zone was stronger for those markets, and it made more sense.
So I won't go too deep into news because I know there's a lot to cover. Maybe save that for next week. But just wanted to, one final topic, ask you about WWE, Johnny Ace, Vince McMahon, Janelle Grant. Johnny Ace turned a little bit here, right? He turned kind of his attention away from what he was initially going to fight. He was going to fight Vince. Now he's with Vince.
Yeah, that certainly caught me by surprise, especially once it starts coming out publicly that he was going to go his own way. I'd imagine it wasn't. I mean, they've been connected for a while, and obviously given this lawsuit in some odd ways. But I think it's not necessarily like, who do I like or whatever. It's more of like a legal strategy, and I think the push is for both to want to go to arbitration, right? So that would be just like a legal maneuvering strategy. So it's best for them to put egos aside, and both be aligned, if that's what the lawyers think is best, so that whatever repercussions happen, that they mitigate that, or even try and get out of this completely.
Yeah, so it's good for him legally. That's really not that he's thinking about Vince. He's really thinking about himself and legally, and how to end this thing quicker.
Yeah, that's what I would imagine. I mean, we've seen Vince in Manhattan or wherever, like, out and about town. I don't imagine you'd see them out to dinner, or hopefully not hanging out privately, given what's the accusations in the past. But I think this is just a illegal maneuver, and sometimes, especially Vince, sometimes you have the right amount of money and you find certain loopholes or things that were done incorrectly. Look, Harvey Weinstein was convicted, and I believe that he's going to get released, if I understand it correctly, because of an improper procedural rule. I'm not an expert on that, but that's why you have the best lawyers, because unless the police and the legal team and whatever it may be, the process, you find one little thing, and the whole case can unravel even years later, right? The same in a different circumstance, but right, that's how Bill Cosby got out too, right? You go through this in a fine tooth comb, and you're like, okay, this wasn't done procedurally correctly, and the judge has to say, yeah, we agree, and you can't try someone again for the same crime. So it's in a way, it's a shame.
Very true. Let's head towards the finish here and hit the plugs. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram at 2Man Power Trip. Lavie, what do you got?
Yeah, follow me on X at Lavie Marg, LAVIE MARG. Check out my long form articles on linecupjobsearch.com, and join our group, The Business of the Business, on LinkedIn, as we are the official business podcast of PW Ponderings. The YouTube portion of this podcast is typically drops there, and we are distributed by the Creative Control Network.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. See you right back here next week for a little business of the business. We'll see you next week, folks.